September 15th, 1944. 8:32 hours. Peleliu Island, Palau Islands. Private First Class Eugene Bondurant Sledge, 20 years old from Mobile, Alabama, crouched in the well of his LVDA, one Amtrak as it churned toward the beaches of Peleliu. Around him, 34 Marines from K Company, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, 1st Marine Division, gripped their M1 Garand rifles with white knuckles. The amphibious tractor's diesel engine roared. Salt spray drenched their utilities. Above them, naval shells screamed overhead toward the island, creating continuous thunder that had lasted 3 days. Sledge had joined the Marines in December 1942, driven by patriotic fervor after Pearl Harbor. He had washed out of officer candidate school due to a heart murmur discovered during his physical. Rather than accept a medical discharge, he enlisted as a private. He trained at boot camp in San Diego, then specialist training as a 60mm mortar man. By September 1944, he had not yet seen combat. Peleliu would be his first battle. The island ahead appeared as a jagged ridge of coral and limestone rising from turquoise water. Peleliu measured roughly 6 square miles, shaped like a lobster claw. Its highest point, a complex of ridges the Marines would come to call Bloody Nose Ridge, rose 300 feet above sea level. Dense jungle covered the lowlands. Coral limestone formations, honeycombed with natural caves, dominated the northern highlands. What Sledge and his fellow Marines did not know as they approached the beach was that they were heading into a battle that should never have been fought. The strategic debate had begun months earlier. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, had proposed a bold plan to bypass the Philippines entirely and strike directly at Formosa, modern-day Taiwan. This strategy would cut Japanese supply lines, isolate their forces in the Philippines, and position American forces 400 miles from the Japanese home islands. The plan made strategic sense. It would save time, resources, and lives. General Douglas MacArthur vehemently disagreed. MacArthur had promised to return to the Philippines when he evacuated in March 1942, famously declaring, "I shall return upon reaching Australia." He viewed the liberation of the Philippines as a moral obligation to the Filipino people who had fought alongside American forces. He also saw it as essential to American honor and his own legacy. MacArthur possessed immense political influence in Washington. President Franklin Roosevelt, facing re-election in November 1944, could not ignore MacArthur's arguments. On July 26, 1944, Roosevelt met with both MacArthur and Nimitz in Pearl Harbor to resolve the strategic dispute. MacArthur presented his case for liberating the Philippines with characteristic passion and political skill. Nimitz defended his Formosa plan with calm naval logic. Roosevelt sided with MacArthur. The Philippines would be liberated. This decision created a problem. MacArthur's planned invasion of the Philippines required secure flanks. Japanese air bases in Palau Islands, 500 miles east of the Philippines, could threaten the invasion fleet. Intelligence indicated that Peleliu housed a significant airfield. If Japanese aircraft based on Peleliu attacked the invasion fleet, they could inflict serious damage. Therefore, Peleliu needed to be neutralized. The operation received the code name Stalemate 2. Major General William Rupertus, commanding the 1st Marine Division, confidently predicted the battle would last 3 or 4 days. His intelligence staff estimated Japanese strength at 10,000 troops. They assessed Japanese fortifications as standard construction that naval bombardment would effectively destroy. Rupertus told his Marines they would be back aboard ship within a week. Every one of these assessments proved catastrophically wrong. Colonel Kunio Nakagawa commanded the Japanese garrison on Peleliu. Unlike many Japanese commanders who relied on banzai charges and beach defenses in previous battles, Nakagawa had studied American tactics carefully. He recognized that Japanese forces could not prevent American landings. Naval gunfire and air superiority made beach defenses suicidal. The fanatical counterattacks that had characterized Japanese tactics at Tarawa, Saipan, and Guam had achieved nothing except high casualties. Nakagawa developed a revolutionary defensive strategy. He would not contest the beaches. He would not launch wasteful banzai charges. Instead, he would transform Peleliu's natural cave systems into an interconnected fortress. His troops would fight from prepared positions, inflict maximum casualties, and prolong the battle as long as possible. Every day Peleliu held out was another day the Americans could not use it as a base. Every Marine killed or wounded on Peleliu was one less Marine available for future operations. Nakagawa's engineers worked for months transforming Peleliu into a fortress. They expanded natural caves in the coral limestone ridges. They connected cave systems with tunnels. They installed steel doors salvaged from ships. They created multiple firing positions with interlocking fields of fire. They stockpiled ammunition, food, and water in underground chambers. They positioned artillery pieces in caves where they could fire and then withdraw before American counter-battery fire arrived. They wired the entire system with communications lines. The result was unlike anything American forces had encountered in the Pacific. Nakagawa created a defense in depth that extended across the entire island and deep underground. His 10,695 troops, primarily from the 14th Infantry Division reinforced by naval infantry and labor troops, occupied positions that American naval gunfire could not reach and American infantry would have to clear one by one. The pre-invasion bombardment that began on September 12, 1944, demonstrated the futility of conventional tactics against Nakagawa's fortress. For 3 days, battleships, cruisers, and destroyers pounded Peleliu with thousands of shells. Aircraft dropped hundreds of tons of bombs. The Navy reported destroying most Japanese positions. Marine intelligence officers observed the bombardment and reported significant damage to enemy fortifications. They were wrong. Nakagawa's troops waited in their caves. The bombardment destroyed surface structures and vegetation. It created craters in the airfield. It killed exposed troops and destroyed equipment left deliberately visible. But it did not reach the caves. It did not destroy the interconnected defensive system. It did not significantly degrade Japanese combat power. When Sledge's Amtrak approached the beach at 8:32 on September 15th, the Japanese waited. Nakagawa had ordered his troops to hold fire until the Marines landed in force. Let them come ashore. Let them believe the bombardment worked. Then destroy them. The 1st Marine Division, commanded by Major General William Rupertus, landed with 3 regiments abreast. The 1st Marines, under Colonel Lewis Burwell Chesty Puller, landed on the left at White Beach. The 5th Marines, commanded by Colonel Harold Bucky Harris, landed in the center at Orange Beach. The 7th Marines, led by Colonel Herman Hannikin, landed on the right at Orange Beach. The plan called for rapid movement inland, seizure of the airfield, and quick suppression of remaining resistance. Sledge's K Company, part of the 5th Marines, hit Orange Beach 2 at 8:32. The Amtrak's ramp dropped. Marines poured out onto white coral sand. For perhaps 30 seconds, the beach seemed quiet. Then the entire island erupted. Japanese artillery, mortars, and machine guns opened fire simultaneously. Shells impacted among the Amtrak still in the water. Machine gun fire swept the beach. Mortar rounds walked across the landing zones. Marines dove for whatever cover existed, which was almost none. The white coral sand provided no concealment. The beach offered no natural protection. The only cover came from destroyed Amtraks and fallen Marines. Sledge hit the sand and froze. The noise was overwhelming. Shells exploded continuously. Machine guns chattered. Men screamed. The smell of high explosives, burning metal, and death filled the air. This was nothing like training. Training prepared Marines for tactical movement, fire discipline, and unit cohesion. Nothing prepared them for the sensory overload of modern combat. A sergeant grabbed Sledge and shoved him forward. The only salvation lay in getting off the beach. Every second on that coral sand meant death. K Company pushed inland, following the combat engineers who were attempting to clear paths through Japanese defenses. The heat struck immediately. Peleliu's temperature exceeded 110 degrees Fahrenheit, with humidity near 100%. Marines wearing full combat gear in tropical sun began collapsing within minutes. By nightfall on September 15th, all 3 Marine regiments had established tenuous beachheads. They had not achieved their D-Day objectives. They had not secured the airfield as planned. They had not broken Japanese resistance. They had suffered 200 killed and 900 wounded in the first day alone, and they had discovered that General Rupertus's confident prediction of a 3-day battle was catastrophically wrong. The 1st Marines, attacking directly toward a high ground that would become known as Bloody Nose Ridge, encountered the strongest Japanese resistance. Colonel Nakagawa had concentrated his defenses in the Umurbergal mountain complex, a series of interconnected ridges and coral limestone formations that dominated the island. The Marines discovered that every cave, every ravine, and every ridge concealed Japanese positions. Attacking one position exposed Marines to fire from multiple others. Eliminating one strong point accomplished nothing because Japanese troops simply withdrew through tunnels to another position. The heat and terrain created enemies as debilitating as Japanese fire. Peleliu's coral surface absorbed and radiated heat. Temperatures regularly exceeded 115 degrees. Water became the most precious commodity. Each Marine landed with 2 canteens. In Peleliu's heat, 2 canteens lasted perhaps 2 hours of combat. Resupply was difficult and dangerous. Marines began suffering heat exhaustion, heat stroke, and dehydration casualties that rivaled combat wounds. The coral itself became a weapon, sharp and porous. Peleliu's coral shredded uniforms, cut skin, and created wounds that became infected almost immediately in the tropical heat. When shells impacted coral, the fragmentation patterns were different from explosions in dirt or sand. Coral splintered into thousands of razor-sharp fragments that caused terrible wounds. The white coral provided no concealment. Camouflage uniforms designed for jungle warfare stood out against white coral backgrounds. By September 17th, D-Day +2, the battle had settled into a pattern that would continue for over 2 months. The Marines attacked. They gained a few yards. They destroyed a few Japanese positions. Then Japanese fire from positions they had not yet discovered stopped them. American casualties mounted steadily. Japanese casualties remained relatively light because Nakagawa's troops fought from protected positions and withdrew rather than dying in suicidal counterattacks. General Rupertus remained convinced that the 1st Marine Division could complete the operation without assistance. His optimism bordered on delusion. Despite mounting casualties, despite the obvious strength of Japanese defenses, despite the heat and terrain, Rupertus insisted his Marines would triumph within days. His subordinate commanders, particularly Colonel Puller of the 1st Marines, knew better. The 1st Marines were being destroyed piecemeal in futile assaults against Bloody Nose Ridge. The strategic situation made the battle even more tragic. Within days of the landing, Admiral William Halsey, commanding the 3rd Fleet, reported that Japanese air power in the Philippines was far weaker than intelligence had indicated. His carrier raids had destroyed hundreds of Japanese aircraft on the ground. The threat that had justified invading Peleliu no longer existed. Halsey recommended canceling the operation and withdrawing Marines. MacArthur's headquarters rejected the recommendation. The operation had begun. American prestige was committed, withdrawing would damage morale and encourage Japanese resistance. The battle would continue regardless of changed strategic circumstances. The Marines on Peleliu would fight and die for an island that was no longer strategically necessary. By September 23rd, D-Day +8, the 1st Marines had suffered 50% casualties. The regiment that landed with roughly 3,000 men had lost 1,500 killed and wounded. They had gained perhaps 200 yards into the Ymerbergal complex. They had destroyed perhaps 10% of Japanese positions. At this rate, securing Peleliu would take months and cost an entire division. Major General Roy Geiger, commanding 3 amphibious corps, finally overruled Rupertus. The 1st Marines would be withdrawn and replaced by the 321st Regimental Combat Team from the Army's 81st Infantry Division. Chesty Puller, one of the most decorated Marines in Corps history, wept as his shattered regiment left the line. His men had fought with incredible courage. They had accomplished nothing except dying in horrific numbers for terrain that meant nothing. The battle would continue for another 50 days. Eugene Sledge's introduction to sustained combat came in the 2nd week of the battle. K Company had spent the 1st week securing the southern portion of Peleliu, encountering lighter resistance than the 1st Marines faced in the north. By September 23rd, when the 5th Marines moved north to relieve the 1st Marines, Sledge had seen enough combat to lose any romantic notions about warfare. The heat was the first enemy. Peleliu's September temperature averaged 115 degrees Fahrenheit. Humidity approached 100%. Marines wore full combat gear including helmets, combat boots, dungaree uniforms, cartridge belts carrying ammunition, grenades, canteens, gas masks, ponchos, and entrenching tools. The average load exceeded 50 pounds. Moving uphill over sharp coral in 115-degree heat, wearing 50 pounds of gear while being shot at exceeded human endurance. Water discipline became the difference between life and death. The 2 canteens each Marine carried held 1 quart each. 2 quarts lasted perhaps 2 hours in combat. Resupply was dangerous and irregular. Marines began hoarding water, drinking only when absolutely necessary, and developing techniques to make water last. Some put pebbles in their mouths to stimulate saliva. Others learned to breathe through their noses to reduce moisture loss. Heat casualties soon exceeded combat casualties in some units. The coral environment created unique medical problems. Peleliu's coral was razor sharp. The lightest contact created cuts. Falling meant lacerations. Crawling meant shredded knees, elbows, and hands. The tropical heat and humidity caused these wounds to become infected almost immediately. What would heal quickly in temperate climates became debilitating infections requiring evacuation. The white coral also amplified concussion from explosions. Marines suffered traumatic brain injuries from blasts that would have caused lesser damage in other terrain. The terrain itself made conventional tactics nearly impossible. Peleliu's ridges were not like the rolling hills Marines had trained on. The coral limestone ridges rose vertically, sometimes at 60 or 70-degree angles. The rock face offered no handholds. Climbing required specialized equipment. The ridges were honeycombed with caves, some natural, some enlarged by Japanese engineers, connected by tunnels that the Marines could not see and could not reach. Japanese defensive tactics exploited every advantage the terrain provided. Nakagawa's troops occupied caves that opened onto vertical cliff faces. Marines attacking from below could not reach these positions. Naval gunfire and artillery could not angle steeply enough to hit them. Mortars were ineffective against positions protected by hundreds of feet of coral rock. The only way to eliminate these positions was for infantry to climb the ridges under fire and assault each cave individually. The Japanese would wait until Marines exposed themselves on the ridges, then open fire from multiple positions simultaneously. Machine gun fire from one cave would pin down the Marines. While they sought cover, Japanese troops in other caves would throw grenades or fire mortars. When Marines directed fire at one position, the Japanese would cease fire and withdraw into the caves. Marines would assault the cave only to find it empty. Meanwhile, Japanese troops moved through tunnels to other positions and resumed firing. This pattern repeated hundreds of times. Marines would identify a Japanese position. They would call for supporting fire. Artillery or mortars would pound the position. Planes would drop bombs. Naval guns would fire. The position would appear destroyed. Marines would advance. Then Japanese fire would erupt from the same position, or from another position nearby that had been invisible. Marines would die. The survivors would call for more supporting fire. The cycle would begin again. Flamethrowers became the most effective weapon against Japanese cave positions. The M2-2 flamethrower, carried by specially trained Marines, could shoot a stream of napalm 40 yards. The flames would penetrate cave openings and kill anyone inside through burns or oxygen deprivation. The psychological effect was devastating. Japanese troops who had withstood artillery and air strikes without flinching would sometimes flee from flamethrowers. But flamethrower operators paid a terrible price. The M2-2 weighed 68 pounds. The fuel tanks on the operator's back were visible and vulnerable. Japanese snipers targeted flamethrower operators. The average life expectancy of a flamethrower operator on Peleliu was measured in days. Yet volunteers kept stepping forward because flamethrowers worked when nothing else did. Sledge's mortar section provided critical support throughout the battle. The 60mm mortar could fire shells in a high arc that reached behind ridges and into ravines that direct fire weapons could not hit. Sledge's crew of 3 men carried the mortar, baseplate, and ammunition. They would set up positions as close to the front as possible, receive fire missions from forward observers, and drop shells on Japanese positions. The work was exhausting and dangerous. Japanese artillery and mortars constantly targeted American mortar positions. Sledge watched friends die from counter-battery fire. The routine became grimly familiar. Wake before dawn. Eat if food was available. Check equipment. Move forward with the company. Set up the mortar. Fire missions throughout the day. Japanese fire would come in response. Move the mortar to avoid counter-battery. Fire more missions. Carry more ammunition forward. Dig in for the night. Sleep if possible while artillery fired overhead. Wake before dawn and repeat. The nights were perhaps worse than the days. Japanese infiltration tactics meant Marines could never relax. Small groups of Japanese troops would crawl through Marine lines, seek and kill sentries, create panic, or gather intelligence. Every sound in the darkness might be an infiltrator. Every shadow might be an enemy. Marines learned to sleep in shifts with weapons ready. The strain of constant vigilance accumulated until men made mistakes from exhaustion. The smell became overwhelming. Peleliu's heat accelerated decomposition. Bodies that could not be recovered in combat zones decomposed in hours. The sweet, sick smell of death permeated the entire battlefield. Marines could not escape it. They ate with the smell in their nostrils. They slept breathing it. Some men vomited from the smell alone. Others became inured to it, which horrified them when they realized they had stopped noticing. Japanese defensive doctrine on Peleliu differed fundamentally from previous battles. At Tarawa, Japanese troops had fought to death from fixed positions. At Saipan and Guam, they had launched mass banzai charges. Nakagawa prohibited both. His troops would fight from cover, inflict casualties, and withdraw to fight again. They would preserve their forces and prolong the battle. The strategy worked. By early October, the Marines had been fighting for 3 weeks and controlled perhaps one-third of the island. The Umurbergal complex, which the Marines now call Bloody Nose Ridge, remained firmly in Japanese hands. The ridge system stretched roughly 1,000 yards north to south and 400 yards east to west. Within this small area, Nakagawa had concentrated approximately 5,000 troops in hundreds of K positions. The Marines estimated it would take weeks to clear. They were optimistic. Colonel Harold Harris, commanding the 5th Marines, received orders to take Bloody Nose Ridge. His Marines would assault from the south. The 7th Marines would attack from the east. The Army's 321st RCT would advance from the west. The plan called for coordinated attacks that would crush Japanese resistance through overwhelming firepower and simultaneous pressure from multiple directions. The plan failed. The terrain made coordination impossible. The different units could not see each other. Communications between units were difficult. Japanese positions dominated every approach. Every attack ended the same way. Marines would advance up the slopes. Japanese fire would erupt from positions that had been invisible. Marines would take casualties and withdraw. Supporting fire would pound the positions. Marines would attack again. The cycle repeated. Sledge's company participated in one of these attacks on October 4th. K Company was ordered to seize a hill designated Hill 100 on the tactical maps. Intelligence indicated moderate Japanese resistance. The company would attack at dawn with artillery preparation. The assault was expected to succeed within hours. The artillery preparation began at 5:30. For 30 minutes, 105 millimeters and 155 millimeters shells pounded Hill 100. The Marines watched from their jump-off positions. The hill disappeared behind smoke and dust. Surely nothing could survive that bombardment. At 6 o'clock, the artillery stopped. K Company moved forward. They advanced 50 yards before Japanese fire erupted from multiple positions. Machine guns opened fire from caves on Hill 100's face. Mortars dropped shells among the Marines. Rifle fire came from positions on adjacent ridges. Within seconds, K Company was pinned down. The company commander called for more artillery. The Marines withdrew. The artillery pounded Hill 100 again. At 7:30, K Company attacked again. The same thing happened. This pattern continued all day. Attack, get pinned down, call artillery, withdraw, wait, attack again. By nightfall, K Company had gained perhaps 20 yards. They had suffered 15 casualties. They could see Hill 100 clearly. They could not reach it. The same scene played out across the entire Bloody Nose Ridge complex. Multiple companies attacking simultaneously achieved nothing except casualties. The battalion commander concluded that Hill 100 could not be taken by direct assault. K Company would have to approach from a different direction, work around the flanks, and attack from behind. This required several more days of fighting to position the company. When they finally assaulted Hill 100 from behind on October 8th, they discovered the Japanese had abandoned it and moved to other positions. The Marines had suffered dozens of casualties for a pile of coral that Nakagawa considered expendable. This became the pattern throughout October. Marines would fight for days to take a position. When they finally succeeded, they would discover the Japanese had withdrawn to other positions. The Americans were capturing terrain. The Japanese were preserving forces. Nakagawa was winning the strategic battle even as he lost tactical engagements. The casualty figures told the story. By October 15th, 1 month into the battle, the 1st Marine Division had suffered approximately 6,500 casualties. The 81st Infantry Division, which had relieved the 1st Marines and was now fighting on the northern portion of Peleliu, had suffered an additional 1,400 casualties. Total American casualties exceeded 7,900. The Marines estimated Japanese casualties at 9,500 killed. Yet Japanese resistance showed no signs of diminishing. General Geiger made a difficult decision. The 1st Marine Division would be withdrawn entirely. The 81st Infantry Division would complete the operation. The Marines who had landed on September 15th, expecting a 3-day battle, were leaving Peleliu after 30 days. They had not secured the island. They had not eliminated Japanese resistance. They had accomplished the limited objective of securing the airfield and southern portion of the island. The Umurbergal complex remained in Japanese hands. For Sledge and the other Marines of the 5th Regiment, the The withdrawal came as overwhelming relief. They had survived. They had done their duty. They were leaving Peleliu. Yet they also felt they were abandoning the fight unfinished. The Japanese still held Bloody Nose Ridge. The battle continued. Marines were still dying, but the 1st Marine Division had been bled white. If they remained on Peleliu, the division would cease to exist as a combat-effective unit. On October 15th, Sledge boarded a landing craft for the last time. As the craft pulled away from shore, he looked back at Peleliu. Smoke rose from the ridges where fighting continued. Artillery fired continuously. The island had been green when they landed was now gray coral and black burned vegetation. Sledge was 20 years old. He had been in combat for 30 days. He would later write that those 30 days on Peleliu aged him more than the rest of his life combined. The Marines departed, but the battle continued. The 81st Infantry Division's Wildcats took over the fight for Bloody Nose Ridge in mid-October. They faced the same enemy, the same terrain, and the same heat that had destroyed the 1st Marine Division. They would discover that Army tactics and Marine tactics made little difference against Nakagawa's fortress. Major General Paul Mueller commanded the 81st Infantry Division. His division had originally been assigned to capture Ongar, a smaller island south of Peleliu. The Ongar operation, expected to be difficult, had instead been completed quickly with relatively light casualties. Mueller's troops were experienced, well-trained, and confident. When ordered to take over on Peleliu, they believed they would succeed where the Marines had struggled. The reality disillusioned them quickly. The 323rd Infantry Regiment began operations against the Yumurbergal pocket on October 20th. They employed the same tactics the Marines had used: artillery preparation, infantry assault, supporting fire, and repeated attacks. They achieved the same results: high casualties, minimal gains, and frustrated commanders. The terrain and Japanese defensive tactics negated conventional military advantages. The Army brought heavier weapons. They employed M4 Sherman tanks equipped with flamethrowers. They used self-propelled 155mm guns to fire at point-blank range into cave openings. They experimented with napalm bombs, explosive charges lowered into caves, and poison gas. Nothing worked consistently. For every cave destroyed, 3 more remained active. For every Japanese position neutralized, 2 more opened fire. The battle developed its own grim routine. Army infantry would identify a Japanese position. They would call for supporting fire from mortars, artillery, or tanks. The position would be pounded with high explosives. Infantry would advance. If the Japanese position had been destroyed, they would occupy it. More often, the Japanese would wait until infantry approached, then open fire. Infantry would take casualties and withdraw. Engineers would be called forward to demolish the position with explosives. This process would be repeated for the next position, and the next, and the next. The engineering solutions became increasingly desperate. Army engineers designed what they called the Corkscrew and Blowtorch method. Infantry would locate a cave and pin down any Japanese defenders with rifle fire. Engineers would advance with satchel charges, explosive charges containing canvas bags. They would place the charges at the cave entrance and detonate them. If the explosion did not collapse the cave, engineers with flamethrowers would advance and pump napalm into the opening. If the cave extended deeper than the flamethrower could reach, bulldozers would be brought forward to seal the entrance with coral rubble. These tactics worked but proceeded slowly and at terrible cost. Each cave required individual attention. Each approach exposed engineers and infantry to fire from adjacent positions. The process consumed time, explosives, and lives. By the end of October, the Army had eliminated perhaps half the Japanese positions in the Yumurbergal pocket. Nakagawa still commanded approximately 2,000 effective troops occupying hundreds of caves. The battle continued. The strategic futility of the operation became clear during this period. The Peleliu airfield, which the Marines had secured in the first days of the battle, was operational by mid-September, yet was barely used. The few aircraft based on Peleliu found that better facilities existed elsewhere in the region. The threat to MacArthur's Philippines invasion, which had justified the operation, never materialized. Japanese air power in the region had been destroyed by carrier raids before the Peleliu landing. The island, for which thousands of Americans had died and would continue dying, served no significant strategic purpose. This realization demoralized troops who understood the situation. What motivated a soldier to risk death for terrain that meant nothing? Why assault another cave when the next ridge held a dozen more caves? How could commanders order men to die for objectives that accomplished nothing? These questions had no good answers. The battle continued because it had started. American prestige was committed. Withdrawal would be seen as defeat. Therefore, men continued to die. The weather added to the misery. Peleliu's autumn brought rain. Not the gentle rain of temperate climates, but tropical downpours that turned the coral dust into slippery mud and filled foxholes with water. Marines and soldiers who had been desperate for water during September's heat now lived in constant wetness. Trench foot became common. Fungal infection spread. Equipment rusted. Ammunition corroded. The rain provided no cooling relief because temperature and humidity remained high. It simply added another layer of misery to an already miserable battle. Disease became a significant factor. Malaria, dysentery, dengue fever, and various tropical infections sent hundreds of men to hospitals. Some units lost more men to disease than combat. The close quarters, poor sanitation, and constant stress weakened immune systems. The coral cuts became infected and refused to heal. Some men developed coral poisoning, a mysterious condition where coral dust embedded in wounds caused systemic infection. Medical personnel worked continuously, but they could not overcome the fundamental unhealthiness of the Peleliu environment. The psychological toll accumulated. After weeks of continuous combat, men began breaking. Combat fatigue, then called war neurosis or shell shock, affected increasing numbers of soldiers. Some men became catatonic, unable to move or speak. Others became violent or suicidal. Some simply walked away from their positions, not deserting but mentally unable to continue functioning. The stigma attached to psychological casualties was severe, but the condition was real and increasingly common. Nakagawa recognized that the position was ultimately hopeless. He could not win. He could not drive the Americans from Peleliu. He could not receive reinforcements or supplies. His troops could not retreat. His mission was not to win, but to inflict maximum casualties and delay American operations as long as possible. By late October, he had achieved this objective brilliantly. The Americans had committed 2 divisions to Peleliu. They had suffered over 8,000 casualties. They had consumed massive quantities of ammunition, fuel, and supplies. The battle had lasted 6 weeks with no end in sight. Yet Nakagawa also faced deteriorating conditions. American control of Peleliu's water sources meant Japanese troops suffered from thirst. Food supplies dwindled. Medical supplies ran out. Ammunition remained adequate but could not be replaced. The constant American pressure reduced his effective force daily. Wounded troops could not be evacuated. The dead remained unburied in the caves. Disease spread among the defenders. On November 24th, Nakagawa received permission from Imperial General Headquarters to conduct a final attack. This represented a change in Japanese strategy. Rather than prolonging the defense indefinitely, Nakagawa would commit his remaining forces in one last effort, then commit suicide according to the Samurai Code. The attack was planned for the night of November 24th. The assault came as a surprise to American forces who had grown accustomed to Japanese defensive tactics. Approximately 50 Japanese troops infiltrated American lines and attacked command posts and supply areas. The raid created chaos and inflicted casualties but achieved nothing strategic. American forces quickly contained and eliminated the infiltrators. Nakagawa recognized the attack had failed. At dawn on November 25th, Colonel Kunio Nakagawa burned his regimental colors, destroyed his codes and documents, and sent a final message to Imperial General Headquarters. Our sword is broken, and our spear is shattered. He then committed ritual suicide. Command passed to his executive officer, who continued resistance with the approximately 400 Japanese troops who remained effective. The 81st Infantry Division continued operations throughout November. They systematically reduced the Umurbagal pocket, one cave at a time, one ridge at a time. By November 27th, organized Japanese resistance had effectively ended. Small groups of Japanese troops continued fighting from isolated positions, but coordinated defense was impossible. On November 27th, Major General Mueller declared Peleliu secure. The declaration was technically accurate, but practically premature. For months afterward, isolated Japanese troops continued fighting from caves. Some holdouts survived until 1947, 2 years after the war ended, refusing to believe Japan had surrendered. The last Japanese soldier on Peleliu, a Lieutenant Yamaguchi, surrendered on April 22, 1947, after living in the caves for 31 months. The final casualty figures staggered observers. The 1st Marine Division suffered 6,786 casualties, 1,252 killed in action, and 5,274 wounded. The casualty rate exceeded 40%. Some units suffered over 60% casualties. The 81st Infantry Division suffered 3,080 casualties, 542 killed and 2,538 wounded. Total American casualties reached 9,866. Japanese casualties were even more severe. Of the 10,695 Japanese defenders, approximately 10,695 died. Only 202 prisoners were taken, most of them Korean laborers. The Japanese garrison achieved virtually 100% casualties. Nakagawa's strategy of defense to the death had been literal. The battle lasted 73 days. General Rupertus's confident prediction of 3 or 4 days proved to be one of the most catastrophically wrong assessments in Marine Corps history. No one had anticipated the strength of Japanese defenses, the difficulty of the terrain, the effectiveness of Japanese tactics, or the duration of combat. The strategic value of the operation remained questionable. The Peleliu airfield, for which thousands had died, was used minimally during the Philippines campaign. MacArthur's invasion of Leyte proceeded successfully without significant air attacks from Peleliu. The threat that had justified the operation had never been as serious as estimated. With hindsight, many historians concluded that Peleliu could have been bypassed entirely isolated and left to wither like other Japanese island garrisons. The casualties suffered there accomplished nothing that could not have been achieved through other means. The human cost extended beyond casualties. The survivors carried psychological wounds that never fully healed. Eugene Sledge wrote decades later that Peleliu haunted him for the rest of his life. The heat, the coral, the smell, the endless combat, the friends who died, these memories never faded. Other veterans reported similar experiences. Peleliu remained their nightmare long after the physical wounds healed. The Battle of Peleliu changed American military doctrine in ways both obvious and subtle. The most immediate lesson was tactical. The Japanese defensive strategy that Nakagawa pioneered on Peleliu became the template for subsequent battles. At Iwo Jima and Okinawa, Japanese forces abandoned beach defenses and banzai charges in favor of defense in depth from fortified positions. American forces that landed at Iwo Jima in February 1945 faced the same tactical challenge that had confronted the Marines at Peleliu, an enemy that fought from caves, refused to surrender, and inflicted maximum casualties before dying. The difference was that American commanders had learned from Peleliu. At Iwo Jima, planners increased the pre-invasion bombardment from 3 days to 10 days. They allocated more flamethrowers, more explosives, and more specialized equipment for cave warfare. They planned for a longer battle and higher casualties. The Battle of Iwo Jima lasted 36 days and cost 26,000 American casualties, but commanders were not surprised by the duration or cost. Peleliu had taught them to expect sustained resistance from fortified positions. At Okinawa, the lessons became even more apparent. American forces encountered the most sophisticated Japanese defensive system of the war. The Shuri Line, anchored on Shuri Castle, consisted of interconnected fortifications built into Okinawa's ridges and caves. The tactical situation resembled Peleliu multiplied by 10. American casualties exceeded 50,000, but American commanders had developed tactics specifically designed to overcome Japanese cave defenses. The Corkscrew and Blowtorch method pioneered on Peleliu became standard operating procedure. Tank infantry coordination improved. Artillery techniques for attacking reverse slope positions advanced. Engineers developed specialized demolition charges for cave warfare. The strategic lesson proved equally important but more controversial. Peleliu demonstrated that some objectives were not worth their cost. The island had been taken. American casualties had been horrific, yet the strategic value proved minimal. This realization influenced planning for the invasion of Japan itself. If Peleliu caused 10,000 casualties for minimal strategic gain, what would invading the Japanese home islands cost? Estimates range from 500,000 to over 1 million American casualties. The projected cost of Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of Japan, influenced President Harry Truman's decision to use atomic weapons against Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945. Whether this decision was justified remains debated, but the casualty projections from Peleliu and subsequent battles informed that debate. The medical lesson from Peleliu influenced military medicine for decades. The extreme heat casualties highlighted the need for better hydration protocols. The coral wounds and infections led to research into tropical medicine and wound care in austere environments. The psychological casualties forced the military to acknowledge combat fatigue as a legitimate medical condition requiring treatment rather than discipline. The Marine Corps developed better procedures for identifying and treating psychological casualties, though stigma remained. The command failures at Peleliu had consequences. Major General William Rupertus, whose optimistic predictions and refusal to accept Army reinforcements had contributed to Marine casualties, never commanded troops in combat again. He died of a heart attack in March 1945, before the war ended. Some historians suggest the stress of Peleliu contributed to his death. Colonel Louis Chesty Puller, despite his legendary status in the Marine Corps, faced quiet criticism for his tactics on Bloody Nose Ridge. The frontal assaults he ordered cost the 1st Marines 50% casualties for minimal gains. Puller would retire as the most decorated Marine in history, but Peleliu remained a controversial chapter in his career. For the individual Marines and soldiers who fought on Peleliu, the battle represented the worst experience of their lives. Eugene Sledge, who survived Peleliu and later fought at Okinawa, wrote in his memoir, With the Old Breed, that Peleliu was worse. Okinawa lasted longer and had higher casualties, but Peleliu concentrated horror into a smaller time and space. The heat, the terrain, the intensity of combat, and the sense of futility made Peleliu uniquely terrible. Sledge's book, published in 1981, became one of the most acclaimed personal accounts of World War II combat. His unflinching descriptions of combat's reality, written without heroic embellishment or patriotic cliché, influenced how Americans understood the Pacific War. Sledge described the breakdown of civilized behavior under combat stress, the dehumanization of the enemy, and the moral compromises men made to survive. His chapter on Peleliu remains one of the most powerful accounts of infantry combat ever written. Other Peleliu veterans struggled to articulate their experiences. Some refused to discuss the battle. Others wrote memoirs or gave interviews decades later. The common theme in their accounts was the senselessness of the suffering. They had done their duty. They had fought with courage. They had defeated the enemy. Yet they could not escape the knowledge that the battle had been unnecessary, that their friends had died for terrain that meant nothing, that their sacrifices had accomplished objectives that were not worth accomplishing. The Marine Corps struggled with how to memorialize Peleliu. The battle represented both Marine Corps heroism and Marine Corps failure. Marines had fought with extraordinary courage against overwhelming odds. They had also suffered catastrophic casualties in a poorly planned operation for minimal strategic gain. The official histories praised the Marines' valor, while quietly criticizing command decisions that had led to the disaster. The tension between honoring the veterans and acknowledging the mistakes remained unresolved. Peleliu Island today bears little resemblance to the battlefield of 1944. The airfield still exists, used by the Republic of Palau for civilian flights. The ridges and caves that cost thousands of lives are now peaceful, covered with jungle vegetation. The beaches where Marines landed are quiet. Tourism is limited. Most of the world has forgotten Peleliu, yet the battlefield remains. The caves still exist, many sealed with explosives or coral rubble. Rusted weapons and equipment lie scattered in the jungle. Unexploded ordnance still surfaces occasionally. The bones of Japanese soldiers who were never recovered remain in sealed caves. Peleliu is a cemetery where most of the dead were never buried. The U.S. government maintains a memorial on Peleliu, a simple monument listing the units that fought there and the casualties they suffered. The Japanese government erected its own memorial, honoring the 10,695 defenders who died following orders to resist to the death. These monuments stand a few hundred yards apart, marking the same tragedy from different perspectives. For military historians, Peleliu remains a case study in what not to do. The battle represents failures at every level. Strategic failures, invading an island that was not necessary. Operational failures, underestimating enemy strength and defensive capabilities. Tactical failures, employing conventional tactics against unconventional defenses. Leadership failures, continuing operations long after the futility was apparent. The catalog of mistakes is comprehensive, yet the battle also demonstrated American strengths. The logistics that kept 2 divisions supplied for 73 days over a single beach were remarkable. The medical system that evacuated and treated nearly 10,000 casualties saved thousands of lives. The individual courage of Marines and soldiers who continued attacking despite horrific casualties deserves respect. The tactical innovations developed under fire, the Corkscrew and Blowtorch method, improved tank infantry coordination, specialized cave fighting techniques, saved lives in subsequent battles. The philosophical questions Peleliu raised have never been fully answered. What is the proper balance between accomplishing the mission and preserving the lives of troops? When should commanders acknowledge that an objective is not worth its cost? How should militaries evaluate the success of operations where the tactical victory comes at strategic cost? These questions remain relevant in Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan. Eugene Sledge returned to civilian life after the war. He earned a doctorate in biology and became a professor at the University of Montevallo in Alabama. He married, raised a family, and lived a quiet life. Yet, Peleliu never left him. He suffered nightmares for decades. Loud noises triggered combat flashbacks. The smell of decay reminded him of Peleliu's battlefield. He wrote his memoir partly as therapy, partly to ensure that future generations understood what combat actually meant. Sledge died on March 3, 2001, at age 77. His obituary mentioned his service in the Pacific, but focused on his academic career and family. Yet his legacy rests primarily on his book, where the old breed taught generations of Americans about the reality of combat. It influenced subsequent war literature and film. The HBO miniseries of Pacific, based partly on Sledge's book, introduced Peleliu to millions who had never heard of the battle. Colonel Kunio Nakagawa's legacy is more complex. In Japan, he is remembered as a brilliant defensive tactician who inflicted maximum casualties on American forces, while following orders to fight to the death. His strategy became the model for Japanese defenses at Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Whether the strategy served Japan's interests is debatable. The massive American casualties these defensive strategies inflicted did not alter the war's outcome. They did, however, convince American leadership that invading Japan would cause unacceptable casualties, which may have influenced the decision to use atomic weapons. Whether Nakagawa's tactics hastened Japan's surrender or prolonged its agony remains an open question. The debate over whether Peleliu should have been fought continues among historians. Some argue that the operation was justified by the intelligence available at the time. Others contend that Admiral Halsey's recommendation to cancel the operation after discovering Japanese air weakness should have been accepted. Most agree that continuing the battle after its strategic value disappeared represented a failure of leadership at the highest levels. The casualty figures alone made Peleliu one of the Pacific War's costliest battles relative to forces engaged. The 1st Marine Division's 40% casualty rate was the highest of any Marine division in a single operation during World War II. The 81st Infantry Division's casualty rate of over 30% was similarly severe. These numbers are comparable to the worst World War I battles on the Western Front. Yet Peleliu receives far less attention than battles like Iwo Jima or Okinawa. Perhaps the relative obscurity of Peleliu reflects America's discomfort with the battle's lessons. Peleliu does not fit neatly into narratives of American military triumph. It was not a heroic last stand like the Alamo. It was not a turning point like Midway. It was not a glorious victory like the surrender at Tokyo Bay. Peleliu was a mistake, a battle that should not have been fought, a victory that was not worth its cost. This makes it difficult to celebrate or memorialize in ways that other battles can be celebrated. Yet, Peleliu deserves to be remembered precisely because it was a mistake. Studying military failures teaches more valuable lessons than studying successes. Understanding why Peleliu happened, why it continued long after its futility was apparent, and why similar mistakes occurred in subsequent conflicts provides insights that studying victories cannot provide. The men who fought and died on Peleliu deserve to be remembered not just for their courage, but also as a warning about the cost of strategic failures and command hubris. The coral island in the Pacific that cost 10,000 American casualties and 10,000 Japanese lives sits quietly today, visited by few, remembered by fewer. Yet the lessons written in blood on Peleliu's ridges remain relevant. Wars are won by soldiers who fight with courage, but wars are lost by commanders who order them to fight for objectives that are not worth achieving. Peleliu demonstrated both truths with terrible clarity. In the end, Peleliu mattered not for what it accomplished, but for what it cost. The 1,252 Marines who died there, the 542 soldiers who died there, and the 10,495 Japanese who died there all died for terrain that strategic planners had concluded was unnecessary even before the battle ended. Their sacrifice purchased nothing except lessons about the price of strategic miscalculation. Those lessons, written in blood and coral, endure as Peleliu's true legacy.